I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild audio podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it. George Schaller is widely regarded as one of the founders of modern field biology, a scientist whose work helped transform how we study animals in the wild. From gorillas in the Congo to snow leopards in the Himalayas, his research has shaped conservation for decades. This week, WCS Wild Audio's Nat Moss spoke with author Miriam Horn about her new biography of Schaller, Homesick for a World Unknown, and the legacy of a life spent observing wildlife.
In the mid-20th century, most wildlife research didn't happen in the wild. Animals were viewed in enclosed spaces or in labs. Behavior was often reduced to instinct, and individual animals were rarely understood as having complex lives. George Schaller helped overturn that model, not through theory, but by changing how science was practiced in the field. Schaller biographer Miriam Horn explains.
The norm in the 20th century had been to treat animals as specimens. They were often studied dead on the table or caged. The behaviorists viewed them as insensate reflex machines that you could do really anything you wanted to do to them. And then there were people like George's great mentor, Olaus Murie, who really believed that you respected these living beings. You went into these animals' worlds and met them on their own terms.
In 1959, Schaller traveled to the Belgian Congo to study mountain gorillas, animals widely believed at the time to be violent and unpredictable. He rejected that assumption, and he rejected the precautions that came with it. What followed would reshape how scientists study animals in the wild.
No one had ever studied an animal with a reputation as savage as the mountain gorilla. When the topic came up of George going to do that study, all the experts said he would die. It was a suicide mission. He would be torn to pieces. He should wear armor. He should certainly have a retinue with guns. He himself should carry a gun. And George said no to it all, said, I don't believe any of this, and I'm going in there alone, and I'm never carrying a gun, because if I carry a gun, that will change my affect, and the animals will feel that.
By returning day after day, sitting quietly and learning the animals' rhythms, Schaller demonstrated that even the most powerful wildlife could become accustomed to a human observer.
A silverback is 400 pounds or more. I mean, if they want to tear your limb from limb, they certainly could. But he was the first to show that you can, in fact, habituate these great apes to your presence. And if you went day after day and you became a student of their manners and assimilated to their rules and their rhythms, eventually you could have a kind of intimacy with them where they were curious about you. They wanted to be near you too.
For Schaller, that shift was not abstract. It was experiential. In the Congo, his wife Kay initially feared the gorillas that he was studying. On one early outing, a silverback appeared suddenly, and George pushed her up into a tree for safety. She sat there, cold and terrified, until something unexpected happened.
She's like shivering so hard from fear and cold. She thinks she's going to fall out of the tree. And then she hears a sound. She looks over, and this young gorilla George had been telling her about, this gorilla he called Junior, was lying on the branch in the tree next to her. He was lying on his belly with his head in his hands like a little kid watches TV, watching her like a Saturday morning cartoon. And they had this little exchange that completely won her over.
Over the next 6 decades, Schaller carried that same approach across continents, studying lions in the Serengeti, giant pandas in China, and snow leopards in the Himalayas. His work helped establish protected areas, informed conservation policy, and influenced generations of scientists. At the Wildlife Conservation Society, then the New York Zoological Society, General Director William Conway was committed to supporting Schaller's work in the field.
Conway basically told me that he considered his job to make it possible for George to be George. He joked that being George's boss was like being Albert Einstein's boss, that his goal in life was to make it possible for George to go off to these places for as many years as it took to do this work.
In 1973, Schaller traveled into the Himalayas with writer Peter Matheson in search of the snow leopard. Both men wrote about the same journey. One account, by Matheson, became a heralded classic, The Snow Leopard, which earned National Book Awards in two separate categories in back-to-back years. The other was grounded in observation and field science.
The trip he made in 1973 with Peter Matheson gave me an account of the same journey by two different brilliant writers. I had George's field journal and the chapter he wrote in Stones of Silence, and I had Matheson's field journal and the book he wrote, The Snow Leopard.
Matheson, she says, described George as a hard-headed pragmatist, interested primarily in concrete facts. By contrast, Matheson projected the image of a Buddhist seeker on their trek. But the distinction's a false one, says Miriam. Naturalists going back to Darwin showed that you could be both an observant scientist and a spiritually sensitive writer at the same time.
You had to be a poet-scientist because the world was full of so much mystery and beauty that you couldn't capture it without lyricism and without emotion. If you boiled it down to data, you lost its meaning. And George was just as much a seeker as Matheson, fully present and taking it in with the most acute senses. He kept a journal every day in the field, moment by moment, with this incredible, the most acute eyes and ears in the world. Some of his writing could go right from his journals into his books because his first drafts were so beautiful and so vivid.
The ability to see very specific challenges facing iconic species in a rapidly modernizing world also defines Schaller's work.
He was one of the first to see how vulnerable these animals were to the rapid changes underway in the world, the industrialization of the whole world, the wars that were breaking out all over the world. And so he was really one of the first to say that science had to serve conservation.
In the early 1980s, George Schaller became one of the first Western scientists invited to study giant pandas in the wild. The work was remote, logistically difficult, and politically sensitive, but it marked the beginning of a key relationship built on trust over time.
George spent 5 years in those bamboo jungles where the pandas live. It was in some ways the hardest of all of his trips because it combined this physical ardor, because you're in this thick bamboo, it's icy cold. He's living in a tent, and pandas are next to impossible to see in the wild.
George's stoic dedication to his research, despite the physical demands of his task, served him well with his Chinese hosts.
After 5 years, he had so won the trust of the Chinese that they said, okay, you can go to Tibet. And they gave him 40 years of access to Tibet. He made 65 trips. They gave him an access no one else has ever had.
That access helped shape one of Schaller's most significant conservation legacies. Working across the Tibetan Plateau, he helped document vast, largely unstudied ecosystems and advocate for their protection. Those efforts contributed to the creation of the Changtang Nature Reserve, one of the largest protected landscapes in the world, and home to some of the most iconic and vulnerable species on Earth.
He persuaded them to create the second largest national park in the world, second only to Greenland, and to protect the most extreme landscape on Earth with the Tibetan brown bears and the Tibetan antelope, the chiru, and, incredibly precious animals.
When I ask Miriam about George Schaller's legacy, she cites Bill Du Bois, who wrote The Last Unicorn about the critically endangered saola, an animal so rare that when George and Alan Rabinowitz confirmed its presence in Laos in 1994 based on physical remains, they had yet to be photographed live in the wild. Miriam says Du Bois believes Schaller will endure the way that revered conservationist Aldo Leopold has endured. But for George, she quickly adds, the most important outcome of his work has not been a single species he studied or one of the many parks he helped create.
Parks can be unparked. They can be degazetted. But what he counts his greatest legacy are the people.
Across continents, that influence is reflected in the scientists, conservationists, and communities whose work traces back to Schaller.
George worked in 32 countries, and my guess is in all of them, there are people who in one way or another were influenced by him. Robert Sapolsky, the great Stanford primatologist, became a primatologist because he read Year of the Gorilla. David Attenborough said that George was one of the people he emulated. He taught Jane Goodall how to study chimps. Diane Fossey followed in his foot. As Bill Conway said to me, There really isn't an important wildlife scientist in the world who wasn't influenced or inspired or mentored by George Schaller.
With Homesick for a World Unknown, Miriam Horn has provided a singular account of George Schaller's extraordinary life and work, drawn from 8 years of interviews, travel to many of Schaller's research sites, and unique access to his scientific notes.
I had to read all of his field journals. I had 100 years of family correspondence. Robert Caro famously says, turn every page. I knew I had to turn every page, and I found treasures again and again that I didn't anticipate.
Those treasures have now been assembled into an astonishing narrative about an astonishing man. George Schaller changed how we study animals by learning to see the world as they do, patiently, attentively, and on their terms. That shift did more than transform science. It helped redefine humanity's relationship with the rest of life on Earth. Homesick for a World Unknown hits bookstores this week. For WCS Wild Audio, I'm Nat Moss.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Nat Moss, with help from Dan Rosen and Hannah Kaplan. The WCS Wild Audio Podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Stay tuned for our next episode. And don't forget to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts.